All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to December's wellness webinar for Return to Self. For those of you who don't know, my name is Bruna Nessif. I'm the founder of Return to Self, and I'm very excited to be back this month. We took November off, and we're back with a very prominent and tender topic that I am very close to and is very near and dear to my heart. So December's wellness webinar is all about developing hot and healthy intimacy after sexual trauma with our guest teacher, Dr. Kate Balestrieri. So sexual trauma is a very necessary conversation. I understand that this can also be very triggering. So please listen to your body, listen to yourself. If there at any point feels like this is too much, take a break, pause, do whatever you need to do for yourself. But I do hope that you walk away with a lot of knowledge and insight on a topic that is very deep and heavy, but also necessary, because many of us, myself included as a survivor, need to, well, I shouldn't say need, maybe want to learn how to develop intimacy following experiences that may have been violating, that may have seeped through the cracks and are affecting your daily life now without you even realizing it. So today we are going to learn how a history of sexual trauma can complicate sexual intimacy, and 6 techniques and strategies that we and our partners can do to help increase sexual pleasure and reclaim a relationship with sex that is erotic, empowered, and intentional. So, as I said, our guest teacher is Dr. Kate Balestrieri. She is a licensed psychologist, a certified sex therapist, a certified sex addiction therapist, and PACT trained couples therapist. She is also the founder of Modern Intimacy, and I am going to bring her up now to take it away. There she is.
Hi.
Hello, thank you for being with us this Sunday.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. This is a topic that I find a lot of people have questions about and often don't know where to go to learn more. So I'm really grateful for the chance to talk about how to reclaim your sexual self after an experience that was not part of your plan. So thank you very much, Bruna, and I appreciate the introduction. Um, I just want to remind everyone, I know, Bruna, you just said this, but I will reiterate that I will be talking about a lot of material today that can be triggering for some people. So the video is being recorded. And if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, as Bruna mentioned, just listen to your body, take a break, walk away, do something that feels nurturing for you. And you can always come back and revisit the material in smaller sound bites and, in a way that feels okay for you. Throughout the presentation, I want to just reiterate a couple of other things. I tried my best to be as inclusive as is possible with this material, but there's a couple of things that I just want to state at the start as a disclaimer, that every single person, every single survivor is unique. So if I don't mention something that is important to you, um, know that that does not invalidate your experience. If I mention things that feel not relevant, they may be relevant for other people. And I tried to create a very expansive discussion here today. That said, 1 hour is absolutely nowhere near enough time to talk about everything that's pertinent to this topic. So I tried to include the most important broad strokes to help people get started on a path toward sexual healing, sexual reclamation, and sexual power and empowerment. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Because this is not an interactive conversation, if you have questions, jot them down. I will open up Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we can always talk offline if you have questions that feel more pertinent or involved than we can get to today. Okay, let me just get my presentation started. Okay. So, one additional disclaimer, this is the first time I am using Canva for my presentation, so if it's a little clumsy, just please pardon the imperfections or welcome them graciously because we all have them. So today we're going to be talking about how to develop hot sexual intimacy after sexual trauma. This is a topic that so many people come to me to understand in session, and I think it's, a really complex conversation. So again, there's a lot of nuance, and what may fit for you may not fit for someone else, and vice versa. So I encourage you to listen with an open mind. I'll share a little bit about myself. I am a licensed psychologist, as Bruna mentioned, licensed in California, Florida, and Illinois, and soon New York. I do that because I feel like I want to be in touch with what's going on in the pulse of therapy and mental health and sexuality. And certainly sometimes our geography can play a big role in how we evolve as humans. So I like having the influence of lots of different geographical touch points. I'm a certified sex therapist, sex addiction therapist, and I'm trained in lots of different trauma-focused models of treatment. Throughout my entire career, I really have been treating trauma in lots of different iterations as it arises, and sexual trauma is certainly a huge cornerstone of my focus. My experience as a clinician has been really diverse. I've worked in many different kinds of treatment centers, including prisons for many years. I did evaluations and expert witness testimony in the court systems for sex offenders and other non-sexual violent offenders. I did treatment for those populations as well. And in inpatient, outpatient, and now in private practice, I've worked with people across many different dimensions of sexuality, relationships, mental health, and recovery. I am also a survivor, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means to be a survivor in a second. But about 15 years ago, I developed a program called Revive and Thrive. And I developed this program while working actually with incarcerated women to specifically address the long-term implications of sexual trauma as it related to their likelihood of recidivism. So sexual trauma can lead to, lots of different kinds of symptoms that can increase a person's likelihood of running into criminal behavior. So I wanted to develop a program that really helped women heal holistically and, of course, reduce their likelihood of finding themselves back in prison. I've since adapted that program, and now I will be facilitating it virtually in 2021, which I'm really excited about. And this program really looks at healing all different kinds of trauma, including sexual trauma, but is geared toward helping people focus on containment, staying present, and really reducing the symptoms that get in the way of them having a thriving relational and sexual life. So let's talk a little bit about what sexual trauma is and what it isn't. I think it's important to note that there are legal definitions for sexual violence, but certainly the experience of sexual violence is much more robust than our legal system really has containment for. So my definition of sexual trauma is perhaps a little bit more broad. But I really look at any sexual behavior where consent cannot be provided or is not provided as being an unwanted sexual experience, and therefore a potential for sexual trauma in the body, in the mind of the person who has experienced it. Now, there's a note here that I want to make very importantly stated, and that is that trauma is completely subjective. So what is traumatic for one person may not feel like a big deal for someone else. And that's not to invalidate any person's experience, but really just to remember that there's a lot of variability for how we experience different circumstances in our lives. So if something is felt traumatic for you, it's traumatic, end of story. That's it. Okay, so let's look at some differences in sexual behavior. Trauma can be behavior that includes direct contact to your person, or it can be things that you bear witness to. So, what does that include? It might include things like experiencing or seeing people's sexual material laying around when that's not something that you were expecting or prepared for or wanted to witness. Many people grow up and realize that historically, perhaps their parents left pornographic material laying around, not intentionally to hurt them, of course, but it did, in fact, create an overstimulation or overexcitation that their young bodies didn't know how to make sense of. So that might be considered more of a covert sexual trauma or a non-contact sexual trauma. I think about in modern times through digital media, we have a lot of exposure to sexuality that we're not prepared for necessarily on a daily basis. Unsolicited nude pictures can be a form of non-contact and covert sexual trauma. And over time, the residual impact of those kinds of experiences can feel as great as maybe a single incident or a contact behavior like a direct physical sexual assault to your person. But I think the important things to remember here around sexual trauma is that the picture is broad and it can include anything that causes distress during or after the experience, and usually has a feeling of your sense of autonomy being broached, feeling betrayed, or feeling exploited. So, a couple of stats. Unfortunately, the majority of sexual violence research is based on women's experiences. That's twofold. One, because women are primarily the targets of sexual violence. However, men and people who identify as transgender, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming do also experience significant rates of sexual violence. I think many men are a lot more reluctant to come forward about their sexual violence experiences. And also, the way that men and women are socialized, many men don't often experience sexual trauma the way that a woman would if we were to um, hold, the confounding variable of gender uh, in our awareness. So, for example, there's a new series out right now called A Teacher or The Teacher. And this is a story of a young man who is engaged in a sexually inappropriate relationship with his female teacher. And a lot of his peers are saluting him, championing him, and really kind of applauding this context. And it makes it very difficult for him to process his experience of being sexually abused, even though it was an experience that at the time he consciously wanted. So let's talk a little bit about the global impacts of sexual trauma. Now, again, this may not represent a completely inclusive list of the experiences that people can expect over the course of their lifespan, but I tried to create buckets of impact that allowed us to at least have a meaningful conversation today. So, sexual trauma can impact a person's identity, can impact the way their brain and body, their mind and body interact and experience everyday sort of governance over the system of their body, can impact the way they think and the way they perceive themselves, can impact their capacity for emotional regulation, emotional awareness, and their overall picture of mental health, can impact a person's behavioral responses, and we'll talk more in depth about what that means, can certainly have legal and financial implications over the course of the lifespan. No doubt it can impact social and relational functioning, and of course, sexuality. I might also add here that there are spiritual and existential impacts that can happen, and we can talk about those a little bit more in depth later on. So let's talk a little bit about how sexual trauma can impact identity. So, of course, it can change the way a survivor sees themselves. Survivors tend to have a less favorable relationship to their body and how they see their body than non abused peers. Survivors can have a higher likelihood of internalized self blame for the abuse or assault that they've experienced. Now, this can happen because of the way survivors are socialized, the way we tend to, as a society, make excuses for offenders and hold responsible the victims who have endured the abuse. But also, it has a lot to do with how readily their support system helps them place responsibility and accountability for what's happened to them on the people responsible for that behavior. Survivors may have a negative self-esteem or low confidence related to their overall picture of themselves or their relationship to sexuality. Many survivors see themselves as broken, damaged, or secondary to others. And what I mean by that is they tend to have a proclivity toward self-deference, or excuse me, deferential behavior to others. So they place other people's wants, needs, and experiences above their own. Not always, but certainly that can be an experience of a trauma survivor. Sexual trauma survivors may attach a lot of their self-worth to external sources of validation. Now, it might seem contraindicated to think about, how people would value their sense of self based on how they are experienced sexually by others. But many survivors will have internalized their sexuality as a form of currency for worth. And so this sort of weaponized interpretation of sex can in fact lead them to objectify themselves more readily than people who have not been abused. Now, they also may experience more objectification, and so there comes a bit of a chicken and an egg experience there. But other ways that external validation is used to shore up a sense of worth might be overachieving in school or looking at other forms of how they are received in the world as being a cornerstone of how worthy they experience themselves to be. So, as I said before, people who experience sexual trauma may have a very challenging relationship with religion, spirituality, or a sense of existential purpose. They can lean more fervently into religious beliefs as a hope of, finding meaning, purpose, answers, safety. And sometimes people can actually experience a huge shift in their relationship to spirituality or religion. They might question what once felt very comfortable for them and feel like their religious beliefs have let them down or God has let them down. Now, of course, that's not the experience for every survivor, but some can really feel very challenged to have meaning in their lives after abuse or assault. One of the experiences of trauma certainly is that of self-neglect or a lack of self-attunement. Now, this can be born out of a protective strategy that comes during sexual abuse or assault, in that our mind and body sort of disconnect, and that dissociation in the moment is very adaptive and protective and helpful. But chronic dissociation, even at low levels, can leave a survivor to be sort of disconnected from what's going on kind of under their conscious experience. And that lack of self-attunement can lead to really not paying attention to things like the need for medical care or pain or the experience of daily things that we do just for self-care. So, neurobiologically, there are a lot of implications for sexual trauma. I'm going to try to go over this in a way that makes sense. I know a lot of people, when we start talking about the brain, sort of gloss over. But in short story, the brain is responsible for basically everything that goes on in our bodies. And during moments of sexual abuse or assault or any kind of overwhelming experience for the body, sexual or otherwise, the brain can experience what's called neuroplastic thinning in the cortical fields. And basically, that's the underpinning for dissociation. So the brain says, this is scary. Whatever's going on, down here we don't need to know about. And so this cortical thinning, if you will, or neuroplastic thinning, is designed to help survivors in the moment. What can happen for younger survivors if abuse happens in a very extreme way or over and over again, that neuroplastic thinning in the cortical fields can actually lead to a lack of somatosensory development, which really means that the body and the brain have an interruption in that feedback loop that develops with more neuropathway development over time. So that can lead to behavioral problems later in life, decreased emotional regulation skills, again, a lack of understanding or awareness of your own conscious experience, difficulty with memories, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And one of the more interesting and sort of unknown implications of this for survivors is that actual sexual stimulation may be numbed or kind of desensitized because of the lack of that interoceptive feedback. So again, the brain and the body stop talking to each other out of a need for protection in the moment, but over time that can lead to gaps in the sensory experience. Sexual assault can have long-lasting impacts on the neural, endocrine, and immune systems. People who experience a lot of sexual trauma often will experience autoimmune disorders later in life. Increased cortisol can actually change the structure and function of the brain, and that can lead to higher sensitivities and predispositions for post-traumatic stress disorder later in life. People who experience sexual trauma often experience a higher sort of set point in their systemic arousal. I don't mean sexual arousal, I mean the arousal of their body. And that can lead to increased heart rate, respiration, muscle tension, and of course, an exaggerated startle response, many of which are the underpinning functions and symptoms of PTSD. It's also important to note that people who are sexual trauma survivors can struggle with functional sleep consistently. I don't think that's much of a surprise to anyone who's a survivor. So let's talk about how sexual abuse and assault can impact cognitive functioning. So in high arousal or traumatic situations, memories really don't get encoded in a synthesized way. So when we're going about our daily business, walking down the road, you might notice a car, a blue car, and there's no big charge, right, that comes with seeing this kind of a car. You're not aroused to this sort of stimulus. So your brain says, blue car, road, calm, everything's good. Those cognitive, emotional, and physiological memories get encoded in a way that's synthesized. So later when you see a blue car, your brain remembers, oh, blue cars, no big deal, and you stay calm. But when in a high arousal or a trauma situation, that physiological memory, the emotional memory, and the conscious cognitive memory all get encoded, but in a way where they don't talk to each other. And so this can lead to inconsistent memories about the abuse or in general about life. People can struggle to have a very linear experience of their life. And so they might have memories that feel very spotty or inconsistent, or they might have big gaps in their memory. This is also sort of the core reason why some people have flashbacks or intrusive memories later in life, because the lack of that encoding and synthesized encoding of the traumatic experience might show up later in terms of body-based memories that you don't have a conscious explanation for, or an overreaction to what's going on in the here and now based on events that happened there and then, way back when. So other ways that trauma can impact the way survivors think is that they may over or under appraise risk and safety in future events. And what I mean by that is that depending on the nature of the trauma, someone might be more desensitized to warning cues that something is unsafe in the future, or they may overestimate the amount of risk because of a hypervigilance that lives in their nervous system. People who are trauma survivors tend to feel really poorly about their emotions. So they attach a lot of negative attributes to what their own internal experience is and really develop a lot more negative feelings about themselves, others, or the world at large. Now, of course, that's not universal and it exists in degrees, but something to note. The experience of dissociation is sort of a hallmark of trauma, especially sexual trauma. And that dissociation may exist in a survivor throughout their lifespan and in varying degrees. So many survivors will report feeling kind of spacey and checked out. They might lose time or not really remember kind of what their overall experience of the day was. They can feel very disorganized or easily distracted, and this is especially true and exaggerated and exacerbated when someone has been recently triggered in their trauma experience. So emotionally, there are quite a few implications for survivors of any kind of trauma, but sexual trauma is our focus today. So, survivors often experience, a very complicated relationship to their emotions. Some survivors may feel their emotions very deeply, very intensely, and they may experience more focus on them and more awareness of them. Conversely, other survivors may experience kind of a blunted or a numbing sense of their emotions. Or alexithymia is often something that survivors will experience. And the word alexithymia really means an inability to recognize and name your emotional experience. So in the moment, this can feel really disorienting to survivors or to the people around them. They may feel like people don't understand what they're trying to convey emotionally, and that may be because they don't fully understand what's going on emotionally. Again, what happens during a sexually traumatic experience is that dissociation that keeps us safe and untethered to the emotional overwhelm that might be happening. Our brain says, no, 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 no. You don't need to know what's going on here right now. Just check out and come over here. And so that can lead to a really sort of disconnected relationship to emotions later on in life. Of course, this is probably not new news, but survivors have a higher likelihood of irritability, a higher fear response, and startle response. They may experience more shame, more internalized shame, and more carried shame. Now, this is unfortunately something that can be reinforced by societal feedback about the abuse. The amount of victim blaming and shaming that occurs systemically in our country is pretty intense, and survivors will often internalize the shame of other people um, in their own experience. And this is an interesting sort of neurobiological hijack because humans in general don't like a lot of ambiguity. But one of the reasons that survivors will take on more shame than is actually theirs to hold on to is because the brain says, you know what, I don't know what happened. And I can't predict that it won't happen again. And that's really scary. I don't like the ambiguity. I don't like not being in control. So if I just take it on as being my fault or something that I could prevent or could have prevented, and I just feel really bad about it, it gives an illusory sense of control to a survivor who feels really spun out. And so sometimes it can be hard for survivors to let go of that shame because letting go of shame or responsibility or blame actually means that they have to face all of the unknowns about their experience or the potential for it to happen again. And so it can be sort of a comfort, even though on the outside looking in, it doesn't always feel that way. Um, of course, there's an increased likelihood of PTSD, anxiety, depression, disordered eating, substance abuse, and an increase of suicidality. I read in one study that 33% of women who experience sexual abuse or assault have contemplated suicide. Important to know that if you are a survivor, you are not alone. There are a lot of other people out there, and if it gets that dark, there are lots of resources to help support you through those moments, and we can talk about what those are in a moment. So let's talk about behavior. Now, I intentionally separate behavior because how we think, how we feel, and how we act about it are very different processes in the brain, but often they get conflated. So let's talk a little bit about behavior. There's a higher likelihood of impulsivity for survivors, and I think that is very closely tied to the fact that there's often a tendency to stay in survival mode, or because of that over or under appraisal of fear and risk and safety, survivors may find themselves playing catch up in moments dedicated to feeling safe all the time. They have a higher tendency to stay in a fight or flight mode, and especially the freeze and fawn response. Now, most people are pretty well versed with the fight and flight response, but the freeze and fawn response are the less well known adaptive functions that that our reptile brain employs in moments of extreme threat, or real or perceived. Now, the freeze response is essentially a response that's geared toward playing dead or servicing, excuse me, not servicing, but really kind of initiating a response that either tells a predator that we are not prey they want to engage with, or it initiates kind of a collapse that protects the conscious mind from understanding what's going on in the moment. And for some people who experience the tonic immobility or collapsed immobility, so either a temporary faint or a paralysis, um, it really is incumbent on the brain in that moment to protect a survivor. And so that paralysis can actually serve as a bit of an analgesic, I never know how to pronounce that word, but it serves as a way to kind of anesthetize the survivor and separate them from what's going on in their body. Now, that may not happen in that severe of a response, but later in life, survivors, especially women, are more inclined to a freeze response or a fawn response. And the research on this suggests that this happens for two reasons. One, women typically are not taught self-defense, and so they don't know what to do to keep themselves safe. So that can come with an abrupt realization that the person who they are in a scary situation with may also have a body size and strength that they can't compete with, even if they did know the strategies on how to defend themselves. So that freeze response takes over pretty rapidly there. But also because most of the sexual abuse and assaults that occur with women are with people that they know. And so in the moment when it's happening, the brain says, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. And the added betrayal and confusion that can arise can actually create paralysis. So this can carry forward into other relationships because a trigger, a gesture that a new partner may have, or a tone of voice or something can trigger familiarity with that scary situation before and initiate a freeze response. And a fawn response, I find, is the least well known and well understood response to trauma or to threat in the moment. But a fawn response is essentially a response of accommodation. And unconsciously, our brain says, you know what, if I just say okay and yes to something and get this over with quickly, then I can get on with my day and minimize threat. So that can look like in sexual relationships later in life, not being able to articulate a no affirmatively if this is an experience that you don't want, or it can look like people-pleasing behavior or placating behavior just to get past and avoid any potential for conflict. Other behaviors that we've already kind of talked about include self-medicating with either impulsive or compulsive behaviors, an increased likelihood of substance abuse or addiction, and certainly process addictions. And that can include things like food-related behavior, restriction or indulging, purging, can look like shopping behaviors excessively, and we'll get into some of the other process addictions in a moment. So let's talk about social relationships as a trauma survivor. Survivors often feel alone, even if they are with other people. Now, this is not always the case, but when the survivor doesn't feel safe in situations, doesn't feel seen, doesn't feel validated, doesn't feel heard, then that experience of isolation can feel really loud. And that can happen again when they are with a partner, with friends, with family, even with other groups of people that they sometimes feel safe and really seen with. The experience of isolation and connectedness can be very fluid. Some survivors really don't like being alone, so they may have a lack of discernment when it comes to figuring out who is actually someone that they want in their life and accept whoever's available. And that can lead to a likelihood of being mistreated, abused, or feeling alone, even if there aren't more egregious forms of mistreatment. Certainly, boundaries play a big role in healthy relationships, whether you're a survivor or not. And one of the things that survivors often experience is not being really sure how to identify what healthy boundaries can look like in their lives, or feeling like when they've set boundaries in the past, those boundaries have just been traversed over. So, one of the most important elements of healthy relationships and healthy sex in the future is establishing those boundaries. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. But really, the primary thing to know about setting boundaries is first understanding what are your needs and learning how to advocate for them appropriately. So, different therapists have different strategies on how to teach people how to recognize their needs and assert them. But this is a huge part of establishing healthy relationships and really learning how to heal and recognize when things are no longer safe or meeting your needs. Um, so I'll talk a little bit about attachment styles. There's tons of information online about attachment, and certainly we can talk more if you have questions about it. But when you think about attachment in relationships as an adult, these are really measured by two different criteria: how anxious is a person in the relationship and how avoidant are they. So in secure functioning relationships or with secure attachment, people feel pretty low anxiety and low avoidance, meaning they can let people in, they can also set boundaries, they can take care of themselves, and they can ask for help and give help. So they generally trust that other people will be there for them and that they can show up for other people, that their needs, wants, and limits will be respected. And it won't cost them the relationship to set a need, or excuse me, a limit or a boundary. When someone has what's called an anxious or a preoccupied attachment style, they tend to have low avoidance, so they will let people in readily, but they're very preoccupied with the health and well-being of the relationship. So they may exhibit more signs of tracking and scanning, so looking at their partner and looking for signs of dis-ease or comfort. And the unconscious narrative that's going on in their mind is, if my partner's okay, then we're okay. And if we're okay, phew, I'm okay. So these people tend to be more dyadically regulating, meaning that their sense of comfort internally is largely based on whether or not other people are available and what the quality of that relationship looks like. Somebody who has a fearful avoidant, or sometimes called an angry resistant style of attachment, is someone who evidences more avoidance and also more anxiety. So they want relationships, but they don't really know how to get relationships that feel safe and secure. And so this is someone who, tends to bring people in and then push them away. I really want to be close to you, but I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can feel safe with you. And I don't know if you're going to overwhelm me or consume me entirely. So come here, but not that close. Come closer, but actually, could you take a few steps back? Is sort of the unconscious pattern that happens for someone who has a more fearful avoidant attachment style. A dismissive avoidance style is someone who is fiercely independent. They might be more dismissive about their own needs in relationships. This is someone who unconsciously has a narrative of, yeah, relationship could be nice, but if it takes up too much of my time or feels too energetically draining, I don't need it. In fact, there's the door, have a nice life. Unconsciously is sort of the mantra. These people have experienced a lot of neglect in their life, emotionally or physically, or they had a parent or a caregiver who was so overwhelming in their need that the idea of being close feels really smothering. So, a disorganized attachment style is one where there's really kind of a lack of predictability. Someone might exhibit any of the attachment features that we've talked about today, and it's hard for them to predict how they're going to respond. It's also hard for the people around them to predict how they might respond. And someone who has a more disorganized attachment style likely has experienced a significant amount of trauma growing up. The good news is that if you are someone who identifies with having an insecure attachment style, so any of those that I've mentioned, you can develop what's called an earned secure attachment style. And that usually comes with doing a lot of internal work, working with a therapist, setting different boundaries, assessing your needs more effectively and asserting them, and then partnering up with someone who also has more of a secure functioning in their attachment. And this can be really, really helpful in feeling contented, safe, and at peace in relationships. One of the unintended and really sort of, I would say, not really well spoken about implications of trauma are the longstanding financial and sometimes legal implications that can come from trauma. So certainly in the immediate after effect or aftermath of a sexual abuse or trauma can be some legal involvement. If a survivor chooses to press charges or is involved in a legal case, that can take a long time. It can cost them a lot of money, depending on if it's a criminal or a civil case. Um, it can lead to a pattern of long-term symptoms that really can implicate their ability to have the kind of work success or academic success that may have been their path in life otherwise. So survivors may find themselves not able to work consistently. The symptoms of their trauma may make it so that they are taking more sick days or need more vacation and self-care time. This is not something that is a negative aspect of them, but it can in fact impact their ability to be seen favorably or promisingly in the workplace. Um, any kinds of medical injuries or social, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought. Social and relational implications can have long-lasting impacts on their ability to stay employed and get promotions. And so over the lifespan, survivors may find themselves making less than their non-abused or non-assaulted peers. They may have a more complicated relationship with money because it may provide safety or the illusion of safety or a sense of worth or the illusion of worth. And so sometimes survivors of trauma, especially sexual trauma, can find themselves with an increased likelihood of spending, denting should say debting, thank you very much, autocorrect, and they may have a higher likelihood for gambling disorders, in part because of the relationship to money, but also in part because the relationship to risk can offer them a sense of controlled hyperarousal in their nervous system where they may not feel as safe with risky behavior in other aspects of their lives. And certainly, any survivor who is financially dependent on another person because of any multitude of reasons can find themselves at an increased risk of re-victimization in the future. This is especially true if they find themselves dependent on intimate partners. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how sexual trauma can impact sexuality. And now I want to remind you that this is not necessarily an inclusive list, but some of the more common experiences that are in the research and certainly anecdotally through my experience working with survivors. So let's just start with some of the more obvious implications. Sexual trauma can lead to an increase in different sexual dysfunctions. That can look like having low arousal. It can look like having mixed experiences of arousal that might feel more extreme than someone who has not experienced sexual trauma in their life. So they may experience a lot of libido in certain points of the day and then really feel very shut down in other points of the day. Um, Survivors tend to have a higher likelihood for pain during the sexual experience. That can include genital pain or pelvic floor pain. They can experience difficulties with maintaining erections or ejaculating too early, or earlier than they would like, I should say. And certainly survivors may experience difficulty having an orgasm, either with themselves, or they may be able to experience orgasm with themselves, but not with a partner. And that can be very frustrating. Excuse me, that can be very frustrating for the survivor and the partner. Um, Sometimes this is because there's really a lack of safety felt in the relationship. But if you'll hearken back to when we were talking about the neurobiological implications of sexual trauma, sometimes it's because the brain has encoded partnered sex to be scary. And so some of that sensory numbness or the lack of excuse me, feedback between the genitals and the brain exists because of that blunting or the cortical thinning that we were talking about before. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. It's a lot of talking for a Sunday morning. So some survivors can experience infertility due to increases in their estrogen and testosterone, or dysregulation rather, to estrogen and testosterone because of the cortisol or adrenaline that can be infused with a sexually traumatic experience. So interestingly, with therapy, if there is a psychosomatic element to that dysregulation with the sex hormones, then with effective therapy, that infertility can be reinstated. So let's see, we've talked about the lack or less physiological sensation. And we've talked about that fawn response, so a difficulty saying no despite a lack of sexual interest. So other implications in sexual experience as a result of sexual trauma can include mistaking sex for love. So this tends to happen for survivors who were especially manipulated in their experience of sexual trauma and betrayed by a partner or someone known to them. Different experiences of sexual behavior later can sort of leave a survivor mistaking sexual advances as an attempt for a love connection. Certainly, many predators will play on that as well and exploit a desire for affection and connection. Some trauma survivors may develop avoidance towards sexuality, either with themselves or with a partner, or they might experience a lot of sort of binge restrict tendencies. So they might feel really even accelerated in their sexual arousal or behavior at times, and then may feel completely shut down and like they want nothing to do with sex for a while. And it can be confusing to the survivor and also to the partner, who both of whom may not really understand what underlies their level of arousal or willingness to be sexual. Some survivors, certainly not all, can exhibit compulsivity as it relates to sex or porn consumption. Again, hypersexuality or hyposexuality are subjective terms. It is up to each person individually to evaluate how much sex is too much or compulsive, and how much sex might mean more of like a restrictive or an avoidant or anorexic stand with sex. Two people can be doing the exact same behavior, but it may mean different things to each survivor. So it is, again, up to each person to evaluate what works for them sexually. Survivors tend to have a higher risk of sexually transmitted infections because of the abuse or assault that may happen, but also because, again, of that misappraisal of risk or a sense of fear around communicating around sexual behavior. It's not altogether uncommon for survivors to experience what's called postcoital dysphoria. So what that really means is they might experience sadness, depression, or crying after sex, and they might not be able to connect why. And it's interesting the way the brain and the body work together. Sometimes it can look like a release of tension that's been held up in the body that gets activated after a sexual experience, and sometimes it can be related to unprocessed grief related to earlier trauma. Some survivors can can develop negative attitudes about sex or feel objectified more readily. Once you've had the experience of being exploited sexually, sometimes that safety mechanism that kicks in about wanting to prevent that from happening again can lead to feeling objectified even when that's not in fact the case. However, it could also lead to blindness around objectification, and people can misunderstand sexual advances again as attempts for connection. One thing I want to highlight about sexuality is that trauma can sometimes lead to shifts in sexual identity or orientation. Now, I'm not at all going to say that sexual orientation is a choice for everyone. Many people have genetic, disposition that leads them to be born with their sexual orientation. However, some sexual trauma survivors can get to a point where they realize that perhaps being sexual with one gender doesn't feel safe for them. And so their orientation or identity may shift. So, what determines the impact of sexual trauma on someone's capacity for healthy relationships, hot sex, healthy sex, and certainly their overall functioning in life? The answer is that it's unique for everyone and depends on a lot of different variables. So, some of the risk factors that might complicate someone's experience going forward are the experience of being blamed for any sexual trauma that has happened to them. Again, we really, as a culture, don't like to think about people as being offenders or perpetrators, especially if we know those people and care about them. And so, what happens is unconsciously, society or people in survivors' families or people around them want to point to a reason for what happened. And victims have unfortunately been blamed. When really the only person who is responsible for sexually offending behavior is the person who is doing the offending behavior. I'm just going to say that one more time. Survivors are never at fault. Victims are never at fault. The only person responsible for sexual abuse, sexual assault, or any kind of sexual violence is the person perpetrating that behavior. End of story. That said, in our culture, there are a lot of perpetuating rape myths and behavior that gets excused, and so that can lead to a higher degree of felt symptoms related to trauma later in life. When some survivors disclose their abuse, they experience what's called secondary victimization, and that can happen when they are not believed. It can happen if they are blamed or shamed. It can happen if they are told to keep it a secret. It can happen if they experience any kind of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it mishandling with the legal system or with the medical system or with even within the therapeutic systems or within their friend groups, peer groups, or family. So when there's a complication around disclosure, that can sometimes really have long-lasting implications on someone's experience of the trauma itself. So lack of support can lead someone to have more exacerbated symptoms. Working with providers or law enforcement who are not trauma informed can be really scary. And even in 2020, there are lots of providers and law enforcement personnel who have biases that they're not aware of and certainly are not the most sensitive around trauma. So iatrogenic trauma, or trauma that's experienced when you are engaging with someone who's supposed to be helping, it is not as uncommon as we would like it to be. And if that is your experience, I would encourage you to find other providers to help you, because there are really great providers and law enforcement people out there. Um, Certainly, experiences and messaging from religion, culture, family, or community can play a large role in how we experience sexual trauma. Oh my gosh, are we really at 12 o'clock already? Okay, I'm going to try to go really fast. There's so much information to share. All of these other messages that we receive can have an impact. And then what can help us do better in our relationship to our own experience is if we have support. Really great support is necessary. So if you don't have support in your inner circle, I implore you to go out and find new people to be a part of your immediate circle, because support is going to be a make or break factor in your healing. The other thing that I want to talk about here is staying mindful and present in the moment. So, like with any trauma, we have the tendency to go into the past or go into the future as a means of making sense of the experience. And staying present and mindful in the current moment can help with the dissipation of symptoms and can help with containment and being able to stay present with what you need and what you're not going to be okay with in the moment. So, the healing journey is an ongoing process, and it usually is twofold. It's a process that happens internally within yourself, and then certainly with a partner, if you choose to include them, or if you're in relationship with a partner. So, a couple of things to think about when you're healing internally. There's typically 3 stages that a survivor goes through, and that is the immediate reaction to the abuse or the assault. Um, so this looks like finding safety, making disclosure, getting containment over emotions that feel really big, or giving some sort of life and vitality if you feel emotionally over-contained and shut down. The next stage is really about getting back to your day-to-day life, and there's no rhyme or reason for what this needs to look like. Everyone is different for how they adjust to life after trauma, but it's a process that can happen, relatively quickly, or can take 6 months to a year, sometimes a couple of years. The long-term reorganization, what this really means is, how do you make sense of who you are again after trauma and redefine how you see yourself and really sort of assimilate this experience into how you construct your own identity and make sense of whatever you need to make sense with as it relates to the person who perpetrated the violence against you. Now, I'm not saying that includes forgiveness, but it can. But really sort of whatever you need to understand about that event to be able to find peace within yourself. It's a long-term process. With a partner, and certainly if you are someone who is dating or does not have a long-term partner, then it's necessary to think about, how do you evaluate risk and safety? How do you discern what you want to explain or address with them, and when? Taking a leap of faith is really necessary and sometimes the scariest part for survivors in relationships. But with every leap of faith that's taken, reevaluating, how does it feel? Where can you lean in, and where do you maybe need to set different boundaries or take a step back from the dynamic? And when you're working with a therapist, learning how to really be collaborative in that process. No therapist should be directive with you in your healing process. You get to set the pace. You get to decide your goals. You get to define what healthy means for you. And it's really important to find a therapist who is specialized in treating sexual trauma, because it carries additional knowledge and skill set that some therapists only have sort of a cursory knowledge in. Um, and one thing that's really key to remember, and one of the questions I get asked the most frequently is, do I have to go through and talk about the entire experience? And the answer is no. In order to heal in therapy, you do not need to go into every nitty-gritty detail. You can if that's important to you, but therapy for sexual trauma does not mean you have to relive it. So some effective therapies are individual therapy, of course, couples therapy, if this is impacting your relationship. Group therapy can be wildly beneficial because it gives you a chance to practice giving and receiving feedback, setting boundaries and enforcing boundaries, and feeling support from people who, are like-minded and have your back. One thing to think about is that healing really is about what makes sense for you, and there's no rigid blueprint about what that looks like. So, if therapy is something that's effective, great. If breath work is effective for you, great. If body work is effective, great. Find something that makes sense for you and aligns with your needs, and that will be the make or break point for you. Okay, so let's get into what are the ways that you can really ensure healthy relationships, hot sex. I think about this in terms of 6 different domains, and it's a fluid process. There's a lot of overlap between these different categories. And really, these are things to think about as it relates to your relationship and your sexuality with yourself or with a partner. So let's talk about education first. So, one of the things that is so important here is learning about sex, learning about trauma, and doing it on a timetable that works for you so that you're equipped and prepared to know as much as you can know about these things. Whether you're a sexual trauma survivor or not, learning about sex is really going to be important and will help you be more decisive on what works for you and what doesn't and why. And then it will give you language to help educate your partner and certainly to hear what your partner's needs are as well. So when you're working with a new partner or even a partner you've been with for a while, if you haven't had an in-depth conversation about sex, I find it to be really important to do that before you're intimate with them, and certainly communicate during. Tell them what you like, tell them what you don't. Ask them what they like, ask them what they don't. Be in constant evaluation, and that can give you a sense of being more in control, more autonomous, and have a more mutual experience. So think about what your triggers might be sexually and talk about that. So if a specific position is something that's triggering for you, it's okay to say, hey, this doesn't work for me. You don't need to give detailed explanations about why. Your simple, this doesn't work for me, is enough. Talk about those deal breakers. If someone doesn't respect your limits, what's your plan? Are you going to leave? Are you going to fawn? What will you do? And you may decide that in the moment, or you may have a plan ahead of time. If you have any sexual functioning things that you want a partner to know, it's okay to talk about that beforehand. And not only okay, it's really important because it can really destigmatize the experience. It can take shame away and give you a lot more levity to play with in the moment. And one of the things that sexual trauma survivors and their partners will often talk about is how the trauma may have impacted their arousal. So some survivors might find themselves avoiding anything that reminds them of the sexual violation. However, other survivors may actually develop arousal to things that happened during the violation. Neither is right or wrong, neither is good or bad. It's all about each survivor's relationship to the behavior. For some survivors, it might feel like that shuts them down. For others, it gives them a sense of empowerment and autonomy because they're calling the shots now. So explore different sources of education that are meaningful for you. Make sure if you're going to look at erotic literature or erotic videos that you are sourcing them from ethically produced sources, because the last thing you want is unexpected trauma or the reinforcement of things that you're trying to break free of. Okay. Last but not least, I'm going to just emphasize here, this is one of my personal pet peeves when I'm working with people about their experiences in the dating community. Not enough people are talking about STIs. So get educated about STIs, get tested regularly if you have sex with multiple partners, and drop the shame around STIs. Whether you are positive for something or negative for something, doesn't matter. It does not impact your worth. There are lots of ways to have safe and erotic sex, regardless of what your sexual health panel looks like, but not talking about it is not an option in my book. Not talking about it perpetuates the risk of sexually transmitted infections being passed along without consent, and that can be perceived as another kind of sexual trauma. Okay, so let's talk about permission for a second. And when I talk about permission, I'm really thinking about it in terms of what do you permit internally, intrapsychically, for yourself and your relationship to your own sexuality? And then how do you talk about permission, consent, autonomy, and power with a partner? So, some things to think about are whether or not you're really ready to be sexual, in the mood. Do you have a long laundry list of things that you have to do? And if you show up, it's actually going to get in the way of you being able to enjoy it? Because when you are a trauma survivor, a sexual trauma survivor, really paying attention to what your body needs, wants, and is ready for is essential in rewriting the script for sexual empowerment. If you're someone who falls down on yourself or doesn't pay attention to those cues, you unconsciously might be reinforcing an idea that sexuality is an obligation or something that is done to you instead of something that you want and are participating in with fervor. So, before you're sexual with someone, especially a new partner, think about what the exchange means for you. Casual sex is totally okay as long as both people are on the same page about that. But if you're someone who's looking for something more than that, try to make sure that you're on the same page with someone. Now, it's hard to predict because some people are not always honest about that, but take your time and get to know what someone's motives are. Really pay attention to affirmative consent. It's it's incredibly powerful to say no because it means your yes is that much more enthusiastic. So practice saying no, practice saying yes very affirmatively, very effectively. Make sure you stop if you're experiencing anything that feels uncomfortable or if you start feeling dissociation. Dissociation in the moment can be worked through sometimes, and it's helpful if you ground externally to something that's going on outside of you, and if you have a partner that you trust and you can talk with about that, you can teach them about your cues for dysregulation, and you can check in with each other more proactively. Make sure that you challenge any negative self-talk, even if you have an experience that doesn't sit well with you. Try to challenge any negative self-appraisal or comparisons to other people, because that kind of self-talk can really erode sexual empowerment moving forward. One thing I really want to hit on here about permission is that a lot of sexual trauma survivors might feel skittish around sexuality in their future lives. And it's understandable given what's happened. But one of the things that can be really empowering is to remember that your sex, your sexuality, your sexual experience is yours. It's your birthright. No one can take it away from you. And even if someone has violated your sexuality, you get to own it moving forward. It is yours to reclaim and yours to have vitality around in the future. So, when we're talking about safety, it's really important first to define it. People have a lot of different benchmarks of safety, and what is one person's hard no might be another person's enthusiastic yes. So, talk about safety with your partner. What do you need emotionally to feel okay with a sexual experience? What do you need physically? What do you need in terms of your interaction with this person? And then, of course, what are the things for you that allow you to feel as safe as you can feel in the moment sexually? Knowing how you evaluate feeling safe is really key. Because sexual trauma survivors often dissociate, the experience of safety isn't necessarily something they are aware of in the moment. It can be something that they get awareness of after the fact or in hindsight. So think back to experiences that you've had where you felt unsafe or safe, and think about mapping out what were the cues in your body that told you you either felt okay, green light, or felt really uncomfortable, so that you can stay more present to those things in the moment in future sexual experiences. Pay attention to your gut and your intuition. It's really smart, it knows a lot, but also accompany your gut reactions with behavioral observations when you're assessing if a partner is someone that you feel comfortable with. As fun as it can be to be intoxicated, intoxication can usually impair our ability to stay present. So, if you don't have an established sense of comfort or safety with a partner, I would really encourage you to limit any kind of mood altering substances, and build a sexual safety plan or a dating plan that takes impulsivity out of the mix, because you want to be able to feel more contained, more in control, more available to your own self evaluation every step of the way. So, have an exit plan too. Um, Call a friend. If you're going out with new people, let someone know where you're going to be. Try to stay in a public place. Don't go to people's homes. You might get teased or admonished or shamed by a partner, but if they respond that way, that's a great behavioral indicator that they're not someone who's going to prioritize your safety the same way you will. So think about communication, the way you communicate with yourself, the way you communicate with a partner. Communication is so key before, during, and after sex. A lot of people skip the debriefing after sex, but this can be such a joining and connecting experience for people. Talk about what you liked. Talk about what it felt like in your body. Talk about what you didn't like or what you'd like different maybe next time. Communicate non sexually beforehand. If there are miscommunications that come into the bedroom, it's likely to complicate your ability to advocate for yourself sexually in the moment. So don't let things remain unsaid. Resentments are arousal killers, and they can usually lead to us unconsciously showing up in ways that maybe we won't be so thrilled about later. So think about the difference between discernment or having boundaries and secrets. So, not everything that goes on in your mind is something that your partner needs to be aware of, but certainly holding back information or having information held back from you that complicates your ability to have an informed consent is not a healthy situation. Practice empathy and patience with yourself and with your partner. I can't emphasize this enough. Chances are your partner is just as uncomfortable or feeling just as awkward as you might be feeling. So try to remember that you are both just two perfectly imperfect humans who are trying to share a moment together, and have some time and consideration and nurturance for that experience. When you're talking about sex or any of your needs or experiences, use I statements. Going into you do this or you do that statements can feel really blaming and off putting. So, staying in ownership of your own experience is really key, not only because it creates that sense of empowerment internally within yourself, but it gets in the way of people feeling super defensive. Be really mindful of your language. So try to refrain from using any language that feels shaming, stigmatizing, judging, or minimizing. And interestingly, our brains perceive dismissiveness as a direct threat. So when you might be trying to minimize someone's felt pain, it might be experienced as dismissive. And in fact, they might perceive it as a threat, and it might shut them down or might shut you down. So if dismissiveness is happening, call it out. It's not okay. This is a really important thing. When you're curious about trauma or curious about sharing your trauma, permission is such a huge element of what allows these communications to be effective or ineffective. So if you're someone's partner and they're a survivor, ask about what questions you can ask. Ask if you can ask questions before you just start peppering them with an experience. They might be able to answer questions if they know they're coming, but if they feel caught off guard, survivors can often feel really flummoxed, shut down, and that can create divide. If you are the survivor, ask your partner if they're open to hearing about your experience. I say that because I want you first and foremost to feel protected in your experience of sharing. And if you catch a partner off guard by sharing your experience, they might not be ready or able to hear what you're saying or sharing with them. So they might not respond in a way that actually helps you. So that's a big part of asking first before you share. But also because with any boundaries, we want to be respectful about what's coming into us and what we are putting out in the world. So being just as mindful of that exchange is really key. One thing that survivors can often feel very frustrated by is that they don't always have the words to articulate their experience, or they may not always have understanding about their experience in a full way. Again, because memories may not be completely linear or chronological. So don't feel frustrated if you don't have answers. And if you are the partner to a survivor, don't push, don't force, don't demand explanations. That's not going to get anyone anywhere. Try to just be respectful of the fact that sometimes the unknown is as good as it's going to get. And one of the things that I want to put out here is better than the golden rule. Don't treat other people how you want to be treated. Treat them how they want to be treated. We all have different needs. And if we demand that our partner show up in a way that works for us when we're trying to attend to their needs, it's going to backfire for both of you. So pay attention to their cues, their needs, what allows them to feel safe and regulated. Which brings me to attunement. So, attunement is the focus on what's going on with yourself or with your partner. Attunement means noticing. It means noticing shifts in their nonverbal communication. It means noticing when they are getting excited in a positive way or excited in a way that feels dysregulated. It means noticing when they're shutting down, knowing what their triggers are, knowing what your triggers are, and being attentive to those things. Being attuned to yourself and to a partner is one of the most effective ways to counter dissociation and increase your sense of embodied experience. And that can increase your arousal and your pleasure tenfold. So take a moment to sort of learn about what are your tells for dysregulation or for boundary crossing, and communicate that ahead of time with your partner. The more you can talk about any distress signals, either that you observe in each other or that you know is true for you, the more likely you're going to be able to get ahead of those things during sexual moments and non-sexual moments to help yourself and help each other regulate effectively. You know, when we're in a partnership, it's our job to be experts on each other and to help each other return to a sense of safety. If we don't feel safe, we can't get to any of the other good stuff in the relationship. So if a partner gets dysregulated, everything stops and attention is given solely to the re-regulation of your partner. And once your partner feels okay, then you can decide together what the next steps look like. It might mean continuing your sexual play. It might mean taking a break. It might mean something else, depending on the context. Practice eye contact and eye gazing. Now, for some people, this can be really intense, whether you're a survivor or not, but certainly eye gazing during sexual moments and non-sexual moments can increase felt empathy, can increase attunement, and can increase a sense of connection. So now to the pleasure. This is the fun part. So learn about what excites you. It's okay to not know, but be exploratory, be curious, stay endlessly curious about what works for you and what doesn't. Know that fantasies are diverse. No two people will have the same set of things that turn them on necessarily, and that's okay. Know what fantasies you're okay indulging and know what fantasies you're not, or be open to exploring that together. Think about taking things slowly, either in the moment or as you get to know someone, especially if dissociation is a concern for you. Dissociation is, again, countered really effectively when we have the time and space to stay attuned to ourselves. So when things get really fast, then that can increase the likelihood of dissociation. Engage all of your senses in your sexual play. So pay attention to what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and use that sensory engagement as a way to stay connected, either grounded in the moment if you're starting to dissociate, or connected with your partner. And it really can enrich the experience that you have. Sex is messy, so expect the unexpected. Don't worry about everything being perfect. Don't worry about if you're not fully happy with the way your body looks in a specific position or the sounds that it makes. This is normal. Everybody's body has rules. Everybody's body has cellulite. Everybody's body has imperfections. Those are beautiful, and they make you you. Don't apologize for them. You never have to. And if someone asks you to change something about your physical person, there's a bigger issue in the relationship there to be addressed. One of the things that can be really kind of tough for survivors is letting go of control. And sometimes it's happening unconsciously. And so one of the things that might get in the way of really experiencing a pleasurable sexual sensation or an orgasm is your willingness to let go and to surrender to the sensations. So when you get to a place where you feel comfortable with a partner, the next step and sort of the lasting step is really on you. We are all responsible for our own orgasms. And so there's an element of technique that's involved with your partner. But if they're doing everything that you know should hit all the bells and whistles just right, the last thing is really about your willingness to surrender. So think about ways that you might be able to practice doing that in a way that feels okay and comfortable and nurturing, sexually and non-sexually. Don't worry about it if you don't have an orgasm. Not every sexual experience needs an orgasm to be pleasurable. Don't worry about it if your partner doesn't have one. If it's something that is chronic, you can address it together, but every once in a while, it's okay. Don't try to force it. The two worst things that can happen with sexual pleasure is being performative, right? So feeling like you have to show up a certain way, and then faking pleasure. It does a disservice to everyone involved because you're reinforcing techniques that actually don't make meaningful sensations for you in a positive way. So don't fake an orgasm. Instead, talk about what's realistic. Talk about the fact that an orgasm is not necessary, and seek out additional education if that's something that doesn't seem to quell your or your partner's concerns. So some of the common fears that survivors have are being hurt again, being not believed, being judged, feeling broken, feeling like they're never going to have sex again that is really powerful and meaningful. And, all I can say is that resilience is a beautiful gift. And the more you invest in yourself, the more these thoughts and fears go away. A lot of fears that partners have is that their partner, who is a survivor, will be afraid to be sexual, or that they might hurt their partner sexually or non-sexually. A lot of partners don't know what to do if they experience their partner being triggered. So this is a really great opportunity to sort of talk about these things in a non-sexual context. Give your partner the tips and the cues that you need to feel okay. And if you are a partner listening to this, or for survivors who want to share this later with their partners, one of the things that I recommend is that partners go out and educate themselves about the impacts of sexual trauma. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to know everything that is unique to you about your experience, but sometimes it can feel like a burden for a survivor to have to educate partners 100% on what it means to be a survivor. So partners, if you want to do something really meaningful, I encourage you to go out and educate yourself on what it feels like to be a survivor. Okay, so some parting thoughts. No two experiences are identical. No two survivors are identical. Trauma is completely subjective. So if something doesn't feel traumatic for you, that's okay. If something does, that's okay too. Try not to compare your trauma. Try not to define your trauma by other people's experience or their feedback to you. If something has felt traumatic for you, then it was. It's the only criteria needed. Well, as the time boundary has clearly shown us, 1 hour is not enough to go over all this information. And I know there's a bunch of stuff that got left out. So again, if I didn't hit on something that's important to you, know that that does not invalidate your experience. One thing I want to talk about is that healing is an ever-evolving process. You might feel really good for a while, and then something happens in life, and there might be an uptick in your sensitivity to trauma triggers. That's to be expected, because as you continue throughout your life and as you evolve, the way that you assimilate what it means to have had that experience may change as new information is brought into your world. So, for example, when people get engaged, get married, get pregnant, have a baby, experience deaths in their family, it can kick up symptoms of trauma and sort of a need to reorganize that experience again. So expect that healing is not a one and done situation, but rather a process of constant reintegration throughout your life that at times might feel a little bit more loud than other times, but it does not need to define who you are or your path. So I'm going to stop here and ask for questions. I also do have a program that will start on January 25th. It's a virtual program that blends trauma-sensitive yoga with more education about healing from all different kinds of trauma, and goes a lot more deep into how to set boundaries and how to use your body as a compass for what works for you and what doesn't, and how to articulate that with partners. So if you're interested in more information, feel free to reach out. So, Bruna, I will ask you to make everything live again.
Yes. Thank you so much.
And
That was incredible. A wealth of knowledge. I found myself even like here getting emotional at some parts. It was very reaffirming and hard, honestly, some parts.
yeah,
But as I say, you got to feel to heal. So
yes, you do.
we are here. I know we ran over, so if anyone needs to leave, feel free.
Mhm.
You're going to get this entire video, so don't feel like you're going to miss out on anything. But if you do have any questions, now is the time. Just drop it in the chat.
Mhm. Yeah.
Please,
And the next screen, oh, sorry. The next screen that I didn't get to is just my contact information. So I'll pop it in the chat here for everyone. But check out my website for lots of information about trauma, mental health, relationships, sexuality. It's modernintimacy.com. Feel free to email if there are questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in the whole group, or anything that you want more resources on.
yes. Speak now or forever.
Oh, Bruna, I just want to say thank you. I know I went way over the time boundary here, but it's just not enough time to talk about all of this in a way that's really sensitive and meaningful.
No, and I appreciate that. You are, even your delivery, safety is so big for me for so many reasons. And even I was thinking to myself throughout your delivery, from like the tone of your voice and the way you um, deliver information and the way you speak about things provides such a safe environment
Mm,
to
good,
talk about these different these
good. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad. It can be really hard to address, the feelings that survivors have. I mean, as a survivor, I can attest to that personally. And, even survivors sometimes stumble through the process, and that's okay. We are just always evolving.
yeah. Katerina says, thank you so much. I will reach out to schedule an appointment. You are so comforting.
Oh, I'm so glad that you found comfort in the presentation, and definitely feel free to reach out if you want to schedule a consultation. And Cody, I hear you saying this has been helpful in ways I can't articulate. I'm so happy to hear that too. I mean, it's sometimes just always learn something new every time I read about trauma, even though I've been working in this field for 15 years. So I think we can all take in information.
Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, obviously, you don't have to answer this because it might be prying, but as a survivor yourself, being immersed in this field, is that difficult for you?
Mm, I think for me, part of the benefit of working with this is that well, firsthand, I get to learn about all different kinds of skills and ways to heal because of my training. And so certainly that's been helpful in my own life. Um, it can be challenging at times, but what I find more often than not is it feels really, what's the language I want to use here? It feels really healing and empowering to be able to help people put a finger on their experience, articulate it differently, and move through it in a way that allows them to get some distance from the pain. And every time I'm a part of someone's journey, it just reminds me that community is the way through this experience. And so I don't know that I could have articulated this 15 years ago when I started this work, but certainly there's a lot of there's a lot of empowerment, in helping other people move through their experience too.
Yeah. Um, well, if there are no other questions, then we will call it. And again, you will get the entire playback in your emails today. So you have that to review at your leisure if you like. I'll also include Kate's information where you can find her on social media and her website and things so you can continue to follow her. And again,
Mm.
Kate, thank you so much for coming. I know we've been talking about this for months, and I'm so happy we were able to do it and that
I
it was
am
a
too.
topic that was so relevant and necessary, and you just led it beautifully. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you, Bruna. Thank you for creating space for this conversation. I think the work you're doing is so beautiful and much appreciated.
Thank you. Yes, we hold webinars every month. At least that's my intention, is to do one every month on different topics. So when I do email you the playback, please feel free to respond if there are any topics that you would love to see a webinar on. I want to know. And I feel like I've been very blessed with people like Kate in my life who just happen to cross my path, and they are so wise and insightful and experts in their respective field and have been willing to lead talks like this for discussions that I think are really important on this journey as we return back to ourselves and really embrace that autonomy and empowerment within ourselves. So this is a two-way dialogue. Feel free to let me know what works, what doesn't, what you'd like to see. I'm here to serve. So thank you, thank you. And hopefully I'll see you guys next month. Bye, everyone.